Yeah, we're there. You can start.
Great, we are now live on YouTube and on Zoom. So welcome to the second episode of Kaleidoscope with Flavia, Dzodan and Metahaven, called The Politics of Fake and Fiction. Kaleidoscope is a 4-part lecture series developed during the lockdown moments of the pandemic and during rather intense and ongoing text message exchanges between Vinka Kruk and myself and Flavia. The last time we did a session where we would, have blocks of basically text or lecture that we would intersperse, like one would lecture, then the other, one would lecture, then the other, etc. Not sure how we're going to do it this time. Do you have any ideas, Flavia?
I think that the previous time worked well, but I know that some people were a bit, this is interesting because now we are going to do meta discussion of a format that didn't exist before the pandemic. So let's have a go at that as well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, being, always very impressed with your work and research. I think today we prepared something that could be read much more than maybe last time's one lecture, but still do feel free to interrupt whenever, right?
Correct,
So nothing here is supposed to be set in stone or linear. Like we can just stop anytime and have a discussion among ourselves and with everybody maybe. Make sure that there's enough time for questions also at the end, right?
And not only that, if during the discussion, during our talks, people want to put something in the chat, they're very welcome to do so because we do look at it, maybe not immediately in real time while we are talking, but I think that the last time little comments in the chat added to it, and I very much like that. So I would really invite anyone that has comments, try not to throw tomatoes at us via chat. But other than that, I very much welcome commentary and remarks, questions, whatever you have as we go.
Yeah, exactly. I agree very much. And yeah, I think maybe we can just thank you one more time for everyone who's there on YouTube, but also our Sandberg students from the various departments. A very warm welcome. And let's start here.
And of course, always thank you to Eva, without whom this would not be possible, because you see our research, we get to be the ones that talk as if we were authorities on anything, but then it's Eva behind the scenes who makes all these things happen. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to share your screen, Daniel? Or would you like to start, or do you want me to start this time? Last time you started, I keep track of those things.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd like to start with a brief note. I have no visuals this time, aside from one visual. So I'm going to share my screen, and it will be a screen of text. But nevertheless, text is also image. So let's move through that. Right. So I do want to. I do want to start here. During our many direct message exchanges with Flavia in months of lockdown, our focus often returned to that most essential of subjects, the fake. Flavia would share a link to pictures of an opulent canal apartment on sale in Amsterdam. One such apartment was minutely decorated in the style of a spa hotel and showed no signs of usage whatsoever. Maybe this was simply a sign of global capital moving elsewhere, having left behind the Amsterdam canals and having sort of vacated that sort of hotel-like house. And after moving around in this strange space for some time, of course through the browser, of course online, we started honing in on the coffee table books stacked in the living room. And these books are somehow always the same books. Picture books about a 20th century artist or photographer or architect, And they seem to always point to some arrived idea of timeless beauty. And, for those who were there last time, we discussed, timeless neutrals and how that is everything but a innocent or neutral sort of ideology. But anyway, timeless beauty and coffee table books. Flavia subsequently discovered that these quote-unquote books can be ordered as foldable boxes on AliExpress. The user folds the cardboard sheet into a box and places it with the spine facing outward. So you're creating kind of like the appearance of a book by, putting it like basically a box, either on a table or on a shelf. And what we does have is a Potemkin book that, like the famed staged towns in the Soviet Union, mimics the outward signifier of substance while consisting of air. Flavia would often say how these objects are about beating capitalism at its own game. And I think we do share an endless fascination for them. But why?
I'm laughing, Daniel, because in my in my visuals, you will see in a moment the video of the books and and exactly what you're referring to, which is funny because of these coincidences that we hadn't planned. Another thing that I think came out during our discussions on these apartments that were for sale was what kind of aesthetic experience are the apartments trying to sell? Not just the apartment, the property, but also you remember my commentary about buying an apartment that looks like a rituals store, actually. And I think that was what attracted me to this whole aesthetic. Like, why would you stage an apartment to look like a commercial space? I don't know. I mean, obviously I have no answer to that, but I think that's what interested me in that Potemkin, real estate situation.
Completely. I think ritual store is a way better description than spa hotel.
It was a ritual store. I think that everyone that is in the Netherlands will know exactly what I'm referring to in that regard. And people consume rituals, which is, I mean, when you think about it, it's hilarious and tragic, because what does consuming rituals mean? When you remove the capital R from the name of the retailer and you just say consuming rituals, but also they want to live in this space that looks like a retail space. I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of speculation about this, but not necessarily answers. I'm going to share my screen so that I can move into some of this. I mean, I gave this presentation a very descriptive title, obviously, Unreal. I'm tying to what you were saying. I was thinking of Samuel Beckett, no? And specifically in Endgame, when the character of Ham, which is the gift that you are seeing now, is taken from Endgame. Ham sits in his chair in the middle of an empty room. He says, outside of here, it's death. In Beckett's play, 4 people that we would now call, using pandemic language, from a risk group, just live through the end of the world, unable to leave their house, unable to resume life after something they refer to as, quote unquote, the catastrophe. They tell stories, and at times they resemble an apocalyptic version of Alice in Wonderland's Tea Party, only if Alice in Wonderland happened in a Mad Max universe. In Waiting for Godot, the characters just pass time, waiting for something or someone. There have been speculations that the someone that the characters wait for is just God, or some version of the truth that never arrives. I think of what Andrea Yates wrote in relation to Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. Vladimir and Estragon's repetitive and rhythmic behavior and dialogue functions as both cause and effect and constructs the only reality that these 2 characters know, the sheer recognition of this reality and the truth it masks produced their fundamental bond. I remained on Andrea Yates' analysis of Waiting for Godot. In On the Margins of Discourse, Barbara Harmstein discusses need in terms of listening, of the strictly physical afflictions to which we may fall victim through such misfortunes as exile, imprisonment, illness, and old age. Perhaps the one most acutely felt is loneliness, which means, among other things, the sheer unavailability of listeners. Smith goes on to argue that when there is no one to talk to, note that we far more rarely complain about having no one to listen to. We are manifold deprived. For lacking listeners, we not only lack the opportunity to affect others instrumentally, to secure their services to our physical needs and desires, but we also lack their services in providing cognitive feedback. That is the occasion they offer us to verbalize and thus to integrate, discriminate, appreciate, and indeed experience our own otherwise elusive perceptions. Smith's words work in regard to the exchanges between Vladimir and Estragon in two crucial ways. Without each other, Vladimir and Estragon not only have no one to recognize or who recognizes them, they have no one to affect, and no one to experience their own perceptions and emotions through. And this is, as Smith suggests, tantamount to having no experience at all. Indeed, no reality. Does reality collapse because nobody is listening? Does subjectivity require this other to constitute itself through the other? I am overwhelmed by questions. If subjectivity requires an other, and I veer into dangerous territories better left to Emmanuel Levinas here, then why does whiteness require an other in opposition instead of an other like itself? Needless to say, I find myself with no answers, but rather I go back to this idea of the collapse of reality that Beckett alludes to. The lonely in waiting for truth whose reality collapses around them after the catastrophe. I remember back in the 90s when I first discovered the universe of conspiracy theories. I was new to the internet and Usenet showed me a world that I didn't know existed. People who believed that the earth was flat and that aliens walked among us. There was Timecube guy, Gene Ray, a man who I thought was engaging in a new form of internet performance art with his wild and absurd theories of time. Keep in mind, this must have been around the mid-90s or so, when there wasn't such a thing as performance art on the internet. Much later, I learned that it wasn't performance art. He was just a homophobic and racist guy living somewhere in the US and really trying to develop a unifying theory of time and physics. During the Obama presidency, a good 10 years after I had discovered his theories, Timecube guy started mixing his theories about time with political rants about the dangers of a black president and black people, etc., etc. If Timecube guy was a pioneer in using the internet to spread his crackpot ideas, he was also a pioneer in anchoring them in the politics that would eventually become known as the alt-right. Early on, when I became interested in these conspiracies, I realized that ableist or normative ways of looking at these phenomena were off the mark. Ableist judgments like, these people are crazy, or comments about their IQ did not sit well with me. These people were different, but at the time, I thought they were just harmless eccentrics with a different outlook, sitting in the fringes of reality, and maybe just trying to figure out reality in pretty unorthodox ways. It wasn't until the emergence of conspiracy theories into the mainstream with Pizzagate and QAnon that I realized that the conspiracy theories of the 90s were almost identical in themes and subjects, just as all of them were nearly identical to tropes dating back to the Middle Ages. It was then that I realized that these ideas weren't just harmless eccentricities, that once they reached a critical volume of followers, which the internet facilitated, they became political projects on their own. Well, it is true that every village or town since the Middle Ages had a harmless eccentric on the fringes of reality. It was social media that networked them and empowered them to become political activists. It was then that we started witnessing the emergence of the unreal.
Yeah, thank you, Flavia. Like, that's amazing, actually, that you locate these the kind of like the core, the beginnings of these, you know, now quite huge conspiracy movements, in a sense, in a kind of like in moments where they were still sort of isolated, relatively isolated from one another. Do you think that the preponderance of, let's say, networks and technology is the sort of like the key to the way in which these conspiracy theories have sort of like in a certain way like sprawled? Or do you, I would expect that you have a more, let's say, complex or hybrid or multi-layered explanation for this.
In fact, yes, and I will get to that later on. I believe that it's a combination of the network, this emergence of the unreal, and loneliness, and the fact, and that's why I started with Beckett and this inability to listen to one another, or this situation of loneliness, meaning that nobody listens to us. And I think that, I mean, in political analysis, that affect, that emotion is not necessarily taken into account when we talk about the mainstreaming of these conspiracies. But I believe that at the bottom of them lies a sense of community. And that's what makes them relevant. It's not so much the content as the fact that you are talking to someone.
Yeah, because we did not, let's say, we prepared the theme and we have, of course, our conversation, but we did not exactly, let's say, prepare who was going to talk about what. So to me, I was wondering, what is going to be your main angle for today? I think now I know, and I know there's so many angles we have to the subject. Yes. So what I will now share is, of course, is something that of a parallel thread that at some point, you know, will hopefully meet yours in a way that that is, you know, interesting, or, you know, or productive, or otherwise, you know. So if only I could like, yeah, I can actually scroll on the screen. That's great. Okay, so I was talking about that thing you're going to show later on with these cardboard books that are, you know, folded and then become these sort of simulacra fake books, in the sense that beat capitalism at its own game. And we share a fascination with these objects, you know, that we can say are real. You know, they're not unreal. They're real as material things, right? They're not virtual things. They're as real as books, but they just, you know, perform something, right? So indeed, there appears to be something subversive about the simulacrum, for it knows and rejoices in appearances, and through its performance allows us to question the agreements and conventions by which a certain status, the status of authenticity, is normally assigned and established. And not unimportantly, whom such an assignment benefits, right? Because there are definitely different, you know, definitely benefits that are associated with the notion of authenticity. And I guess that, and I'm not sure whether I'm actually, you know, I cannot speak for Flavia here, but today we will not specifically address the implications of authenticity, you know, for artistic practices. knowing that there are many hotly debated issues within which the question of authorship, authenticity, signature, and reward is key. So there are many, debates and questions about this issue. So, and as I said, in preparing this talk, Flavia and ourselves had only minimal coordination. So I'm not sure whether this will be something that she in turn will be addressing. But where were we, right? At our joint enjoyment of the simulacrum. The dictionary defines the simulacrum as an unsatisfactory imitation or substitute. In order to perform successfully, the simulacrum deploys a code that lets its performance pass as authentic. And in order for the simulacrum to be made in such a way that it can pass for real, it depends on makers, right? It depends on, a certain level of artistry, of artifice, in fact. Artists who have had access and understanding of what its code means, right? So there is a certain code that the simulacrum engages with, and you can say that when you pass for real, you've understood what that code means. It's not difficult to construe from there that simulacra are about literacy. Literacy not just about what can pass as real, but also about the system of conventions on which that what counts as real in turn relies. So when Vinka and I talked to Vesper, 8-year-old, about this lecture and its theme, she responded as follows. That's great. Here, I'll write you a poem which you can include in your talk. Here's the poem. So here's Vesper's poem. What is real? Sun, rain, wind, hail, snow. What is fake? No sun, no rain, no wind, no hail, no snow. Right, and we can, of course, go into what this poem means. One of the things that it does is that it does not, recognize fake sun, or fake rain, or fake wind, or fake hail, or fake snow, but simply the absence of those, phenomena in our world as, fake. But let's leave it at this. This is the poem that we were provided by Vesper. And indeed, our exposition of the matter here at hand would be glaringly incomplete without taking into account the notion of sincerity, which, though adjacent to authenticity, is more complicated by ethics than authenticity. Let's say that even when we have verified that something, let's say a work of art, is indeed authentic and thus not a forgery, it is a different story whether that work is also sincere. That's a different story. That's a different question. Even though it is possible to conflate and confuse the two and to propose, for instance, that realness in terms of verified authenticity means a kind of sincerity, because, for instance, date and author are made transparent and inseparable as a matter of record and nothing is hidden, the two don't cover the same ground necessarily. So there's a difference, right? A strong difference between actually authenticity and sincerity. Every claim to the boundaries of what counts as authentic, what counts as, quote, an original, is inevitably an act of classification invested with power, right? So there's a certain power invested in saying this is original, this is a copy or a fake. And that is not to say that the forgery itself cannot be about power also. Fakes can be made with an intent to deceive, and not all acts of deception are acts of justice, right? So sincerity, if we think about sincerity for a moment, it's much more related to feelings rather than facts. And I think here we hit upon a strong connection with what you just said, Flavia, about feelings and the loneliness and the need for actually, somebody who's listening as a engine behind, the things you described. But let us pause at sincerity for a sec. In her monumental study of the development of the concept of sincerity in the culture of post-Soviet Russia, Ellen Rutten notes that the Russian word for sincerity, iskrenost, surfaces in texts from the 11th century, which is no more than 200 years after the language in which this word was written had emerged, or as Rutten says, when the country had barely learned to write. Iskreni, or sincere, is among words that articulate the thought that it is good when others know what a person feels. the connotations and meanings of iskrenost are more far-reaching than merely its English translation into sincerity, you know. So these meanings cover, as is, you know, surveyed by the literary historian Svetlana Boym, who I think we mentioned also in the previous lecture, these meanings also cover closeness and, importantly, kinship rather than purity. So if all words, you know, confront a degree of untranslatability into other languages because of their specific cultural and linguistic origins and links, sincerity is no exception to that rule. And thus the meanings of sincerity may vary between cultures and languages, and it's hard for anyone to have the last word on what sincerity means and does not mean, etc., and so on. So we take special joy, however, in Boym's remark that distinguishes sincerity from purity, because it appears to give hope for a simulacrum that, while inauthentic, can still be sincere. And, you know, that being said, the concept of sincerity is a side note to our contribution to this episode and will be invested more thoroughly from our side, at least in the fourth and last episode of the Kaleidoscope series, titled The Rise of Emotional Inflation. With that being said, I'm dying to know how the thread that you started, Flavia, is going to continue. So I'm going to stop here and, you know, get back to this later.
Flavia, you're still muted.
Hi, Flavia. We didn't hear you speak from the moment on that I stopped screen sharing. So maybe you can restart somehow.
Yeah. Now you can hear me, no? Now you can hear me.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is hilarious because we're going to tell people that we actually planned it this way, that it wasn't just coincidence and the result of this ongoing exchange and shared research, but that we actually planned to talk about the same thing after one another. You just talked about sincerity in regards to the simulacrum, and I'm bringing back some notions that I briefly touched on our previous talk in regards to authenticity. I was then thinking of Deleuze's difference and repetition, particularly simulacra as the avenue by which an accepted ideal or privileged position could be challenged and overturned, and simulacra as those systems in which different relates to different by means of different itself, especially in terms of class issues surrounding counterfeit goods. How if the simulacra is too good, it shatters the class signifier through which different relates to different, that is, rich signaling their wealth to fellow rich. But on the other hand, if the simulacrum can only be detected at microscopic level, like I explained on our last talk, how much of a simulacrum is it, at least in terms of delivering the class signifier it's meant to deliver? That is, if the copy cannot be detected with the naked eye, if it looks authentic and it serves the function for which it was created, then what is real? And I go back to Deleuze. The simulacrum is not just a copy, but that which overturns all copies by also overturning the model. And this is the book that Daniel was mentioning, that we were discussing, those empty shells that actually are presented as books. Does this not mean that simulacra provide the means of challenging both the notion of the copy and that of the model? In the counterfeit industry, most of the counterfeits are manufactured or built without paying attention to the microscopic details of the object. Even if microscopic details are observed, manufacturing objects at a micron or nano level precision is both hard and expensive. This destroys the economies of scale in which the counterfeit industry thrives. Hence why we have informally called this project One Su Bottega, and you saw the One Su Bottega a moment ago in the previous slide. Let me go back to it so that we can once again revisit the visuals. This is the One Su Bottega website that actually gave name to our joint research. The algorithm that detects the fake works through something called feature extraction, using microscopes, using lenses of extreme precision. They look at variations in objects at micro level so that they can detect what constitutes a simulacrum, because the naked eye cannot do that. Then they are able to identify what they call in the luxury goods industry a super fake. Those are goods that have the same material and the same composition as the originals. It's super fake, which is of such a good quality that it can be barely distinguished from the authentic. And again, I think of Baudrillard, a simulacrum not as a copy of the real, but something that becomes truth in its own right. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Brian McKenna from our media lab. Brian realized to me an episode that happened in Belgium, where a religious icon was thought to be painted by a famous artist, some famous Flemish artist. We did not discuss with Brian the details of the painting, but he explained how people were worshipping this religious icon at the church that it was placed on, and that they felt overwhelmed by the beauty. At some point, the painting was found to be fake, not painted by who they originally thought had made it, but made by a forger. Churchgoers were angry, furious even. They felt deceived, the religious experience ruined by the fake painting. But then Brian asked the key question: wasn't the experience itself real, even if it was in response to a fake work of art? Is the experience of beauty itself any less authentic because one is in the presence of an inauthentic object? Once again, noting that the simulacrum devalues the original by allowing access to the aesthetics of the real to the class of people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it, while the fake could be seen as having a democratizing effect. The churchgoers were angry because they had been deprived of authenticity. This is an interesting entanglement in regards to works of art, because this deprivation cannot be separated from more intangible and perhaps irrational reactions that could maybe be closer to matters of faith rather than aesthetic appreciation. If a painting of a religious icon causes a religious experience, is it the painting that is causing the experience? Or is it the fact that the viewer feels part of a lineage that worshipped for hundreds of years, since the painting theoretically exists? Once the fake nature is revealed, is the viewer unsettled in their worldview? Is the viewer upset because she exists in isolation from the history of the painting? As usual, I am left with more questions than answers. I cannot quite separate or again untangle the experience of the authentic from the experience of the beauty of the authentic. But when the difference can only be detected through either an algorithm deployed at microscopic level, or detected through expert curators and authenticators, then what constitutes the experience of the authentic? If an algorithm or an authenticator are deployed to maintain these strict divisions that only money can transcend, in that sense, the simulacrum devalues and corrupts the aesthetics of a certain class, even if simulacrum and real are identical to the naked eye. I will go as far as saying that the maintenance of these categories becomes a political project by itself. But moving away from the notions of authenticity as religious experience, I am also interested in how authenticity becomes entangled with capital, not merely as a marker of wealth, but also as a technology of class deployment. Here on screen, and I am sharing a couple of recent news items about these brands. I specifically chose corporations that face widespread issues with replicas and fakes. And I am particularly interested in these news items vis-a-vis claims that fakes are akin to stealing from the manufacturers of luxury goods. Somehow, this is a narrative often repeated, specifically in regards to intellectual property. Consumers of fake goods, quote unquote, steal the intellectual property of the corporations that own these brands. Because capitalism turned an intangible, such as vague notions of intellectual labor, into a tangible commodity that can be stolen. I feel compelled to note that no corporation was robbed of a physical object for the making of the replica, and we should go back and revisit colonial notions of enclosure, among other tangentially related topics. And maybe I should cut now, Daniel, so that we can keep this a bit dynamic, because otherwise I will go back to the politics of the fake forever. So I will unshare for a moment so that we can make this a little bit more dynamic.
Thank you. Let me pick up. So we just talked about before you showed us that amazing video of the books being constructed, these boxes being constructed. We talked about the hope for a simulacrum that, while inauthentic, can still be sincere. And I do think that the discussion about the authenticity of an art object and the questioning whether the experience that the object gives us is still, the experience of art is almost impossible to resolve, I would say, without somehow relying on the underlying, emotion or sensation or feeling or state that it refers to. And I think sincerity is one of the names that we can deploy for that state. So I wanted to just say that in regards to sincerity, this is something that we will go into in another, let's say the fourth, I think, issue of this series. And I wanted to get back to this idea of the fact, fiction and fake relationship, and offering a slightly, I think, distinct take on this relationship from the notion of authenticity, in a sense, and the notion of the copy or the notion of the simulacrum. I think that there's a separate story to be had about fiction, a separate story to be told about fiction here. So the central concern of our contribution is this idea of the fact, fiction, and fake relationship, or rather the narrative threads that can be created to connect in, these concepts. So I think it serves us well to consider that in late 2020, the Guardian newspaper published a lifestyle piece titled "Novels Are Terrible and You'll Never Convince Me Otherwise," of which the first line reads, "We don't need fiction, the real world is strange enough." The piece is basically a feigned, principled discussion between a man and a woman, in which the man tries to argue that fiction is basically over because we have reality. And the woman is trying to convince the guy that there's still interesting novels to read, etc. So this feels like you know, I must admit that I didn't really even complete like reading the article, but reading the headline was enough. Whilst I don't have proof for this, I think it's significantly true for many people that we at times consider the world around us so full of weird stuff, unexpected news, and above all, full of a permanent sense of worry and indeterminacy, not allowing us to rest or to even relax. Indeed, we're almost literally at the tip of our seats all the time, that factual world around us takes on a role that fiction used to have, right? So, or at least that because reality is the way it is, we conflate it with fiction. So that's what seems to happen in this this idea. Novels are terrible, and you'll never convince me otherwise. We don't need fiction. The real world is strange enough. By our permanent sense of worry and confusion to be experienced by opening up Twitter or simply by living life is fired up, among other things, by the unprecedented frequency of the word unprecedented. The word unprecedented really, you know, literally skyrocketed in recent years. And it's one of those words that triggers that permanent sense of, you know, being on the tip of our seats. This same worry then takes on the role that immersion used to have when a novel, film, or work of fiction would grant us a sense of disappearance. We're at the tip of our seats for the disasters that await us in reality. So this is a sort of like the diagnosis in a sense of that headline. And as we hope is clear from honing in on the claim, there is space to challenge the idea that reality is the new fiction. The sentence, which is related to the first one, faced with current reality, how can fiction compete, is the title of a 2017 Guardian piece on Donald Trump, impoverishes what fiction is, just as Theodore Adorno's famous 1983 dictum, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, impoverished what poetry is. Even though Adorno was right about the immense and incomprehensible horror of the Holocaust and the lives of people to whom a poetry can then no longer speak, in regards to history, it appears to us that a poetry is an unfinalizable process in the same way that discourse is, as was theorized by the philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. We can simply not ever be done with them. Neither can we claim that fiction and poetry, for that matter, remain insulated from their social and political meanings because they go into some kind of special box or separate box. They do not, you know. So I think it's interesting, maybe we can talk about this, that the notion that there's a special box for, let's say, art and fiction and reality goes into the other box or something like that. I don't necessarily believe in that setup. I don't necessarily believe in that architecture for art either. You know, there's a similar idea about art, that art is an experience for after dinner, you know, like after all the tasks are done, then you will finally be able to engage with works of art. But I don't think from our perspective, that's not the case. So the film theoretician Michael Renoff proposed that fiction is oriented toward a world and nonfiction toward the world, which is, you know, an interesting proposition to some extent. Insofar, all reality gives birth to possible or other realities, or invites us to prove the edges and cliffs at their outer limits, speaking to a world while being in the world, or vice versa, does not deny the presence and preponderance of sometimes very difficult facts in the world, you know? As Renoff also stated, fiction and nonfiction are two domains that inhabit one another. And I think this is a very interesting proposition with regard to the normally, you know, quite hard distinction between fiction and nonfiction, that I think is something that is slightly more complex, you know, to encounter. In the long poem State of Siege, written in Ramallah in 2002, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish wrote, "To a reader, do not trust the poem. The daughter of absence is neither intuition nor is it thought, but rather the sense of the abyss." We will talk about that in a sec. And in Dante's La Divina Commedia, the writer and protagonist on a journey to the Inferno is granted the unexpected but welcome company of his favorite writer, the Roman poet Virgil. And I think this speaks to the kind of company that poetry and art can provide for, which is not the same kind of company that criticism provides for. or that the question about the original and the copy provides for. The difference is that criticism provides claims pertaining to the world, whereas poetry, especially when critical, provides building materials for a world, another world. And the criticality of Darwish's poem is not in its being a critical essay. It expresses itself in ways where criticism cannot even go. It expresses itself in the way that it lets its word confront reality. And I wanted to just say this to make clear what's the difference between, let's say, writing something critical or creating a poem like, for example, State of Siege. From our perspective, we mean that poetry, in contrast to nonfiction, stages a confrontation with words as things and words as links and not words as transactional practicalities, right? So we can use words to transact, but we can also, use words in order to multiply their meanings with no real practical result. In the realm of cinema, this was covered by the film critic Victor Shklovsky in a famous essay called Poetry and Prose in Cinema. The potential meanings of words in a poem multiply in meaning through their meeting with reality, and readers, just as in poetic cinema, they multiply even further when meeting images. They are not closed paths or fixed trajectories, precisely because no transactional purposes are served by them. So I think what the problem is with this sentence of novels are terrible and you'll never convince me otherwise, and we don't need fiction, the real world is strange enough, is that it doesn't necessarily make a real case about fiction, but it makes a case about non-transactional, about the lack of usage that there is for non-transactional speech, for non-transactional acts of writing or speaking or communication in general, to which, something like poetry, belongs. And I think that notion, faced with current reality, how can fiction compete, makes that point even more clear. The idea that there would be a competition between fiction and reality, in which, fiction needs to demonstrate an almost economically formulated, preponderance in order to be able to keep pace with reality. I think that shows that we have a fundamental issue here around what words do and what the actions of words are and what the materiality of words are. So to a reader, do not trust the poem, The Daughter of Absence. It is neither intuition nor is it thought, but rather the sense of the abyss.
I know we said we didn't plan this together, but you will see how eventually we did that. So many of
In what way?
So many of these things you were touching upon come back in my own notes and observations. Especially, I'm interested in your remarks about for whom fiction is. No, and I'm going to touch on political fan fiction in a moment. So you can imagine how this is very relevant to this discussion. And I really liked, and I want to zero in if you can reread or find that expression that fiction is for a world, but non-fiction is for the world.
Yeah, this was a quote from Michael Renoff, which is a US film theoretician. And he said, fiction is oriented toward a world, non-fiction toward the world.
I have to wonder, and I will get to that in a moment, how that has also, in a sense, collapsed with these mainstream conspiracy theories that are fictions, basically. And they are oriented to the world, their world, with capital even, I would go as far as saying. I'm going to share my screen again for a second, and I want to complete what I left and finished a moment ago in regards to Simulacrum and what constitutes authenticity. And for a moment, I will take a historical detour to touch on sumptuary laws. Encyclopedia Britannica defines sumptuary laws as any law designed to restrict excessive personal expenditures in the interest of preventing extravagance and luxury. The term denotes regulations restricting extravagance in food, drink, dress, and household equipment, usually on religious or moral grounds. One of the definitive texts in regards to the history of luxury and fashion is The Right to Dress, which the cover is now on my screen. And from the introduction, I quickly share with you now. In the late 16th century, Michel de Montaigne sat down in his library to write about the vexing theme of sumptuary laws, to declare that only princes may eat turbot and wear velvet and gold braid. The French essayist mused, was but enhancing such things and making everyone want to have them. Montaigne agreed with Plato, young people should never change from fashion to fashion in their dress, comportment, dances, sports, and songs. Today, anyone fashion-minded is more likely to associate the name Montaigne with luxury shopping in Paris rather than with a humanist writer who looked back to the ancients. The French capital's Avenue Montaigne is named after the essayist, but it epitomizes couture fashion consumption with global appeal. The constant change and continued spending now underpin market economies. The expression of different identities through dress is associated with creativity and is regarded as integral to the aesthetics of societies. Men's fashion shows mark the annual calendar alongside those for women. Dress regulations, of course, continue to operate in the Western world. In relation to work, leisure, particular forms of sociability, institutional codes, etc., and ethnic and religious expression as well. Yet no one's expenditure on clothing is regulated by the state. By contrast, up to the end of the 18th century, sumptuary laws, from the Latin word sumptuous, meaning expense, sought to regulate social differences in many parts of the world and impose policies about who could spend how much on what types of dress and accessories, feasts and funerals, horses or carriages. I was reading a paper written by Professor Silvia Bombardini from Goldsmiths, who kindly reached out after my last lecture, and she touches on several disruptive aspects of fakes, and I recommend Googling the paper for anyone interested in the topic. But I want to zoom in on one specific aspect that Silvia touches on here, namely, if we adopt luxury brands as a metaphor or metonym for the capitalist system, and as well we should, if the fate of the economic begins to emerge in the form of fashion, as per Baudrillard, this passage applies almost word for word to the luxury counterfeit trade and its most utopian outcome. Specifically, I am interested in luxury brands as metaphor or metonymy for capitalism. And for that, I go back to the colonial underpinnings of these sumptuary laws. In race, clothing, and identity, sumptuary laws in colonial Spanish America, an essay in The Right to Dress, the book that I mentioned a moment ago, Rebecca Earle talks about the way indigenous and Black garments were strictly regulated in the Americas by the Spanish Empire. On holidays and other festive occasions, Andean people in the Spanish Viceroyalty of Peru like to dress according to 16th century documents as wealthy in Lima, Quito, and other colonial cities. These Amerindian people enjoyed wearing a combination of European and Andean garments, sometimes made of silk and other expensive imported fabrics. Their sartorial exuberance annoyed the local Spanish, who issued repeated orders prohibiting Amerindians from wearing a range of garments containing silk, velvet, a cloth that was very luxurious that was called Holland cloth, lace, and other embellishments. The indigenous elite did not accept these prohibitions without protests. In 1593, members of the Amerindian community in Quito wrote to Emperor Philip to complain that as conquered people, it sometimes happens that officials and other people undress them and take their clothing, saying that they can wear only cotton, which causes them much trouble and vexation. The monarch agreed that Amerindians should be allowed to wear what they pleased, as long as it did not violate existing legislation regulating excessive dress. He therefore instructed colonial administrators to prevent the seizures of the Indians' garments and ensure that, quote, the Indians are not vexed. A few decades later, in 1628, Philip's grandson ordered that no Indian may wear clothing made of imported fabric, own a sword, dagger, lance, harquebus, or gun, nor ride on horseback with saddle and reins on pain of the loss of the garment, weapon, saddle, reins, and horse. This ordinance, which applied specifically to 2 provinces in southern Mexico, was one of a number of regulations aimed at restricting the adoption of certain practices by Amerindians. A century later, officials in Peru expressed dismay at the ineffectiveness of legislation aimed at moderating the scandalous excesses in the clothing worn by Black people, mulattoes, Indians, and mestizos of both sexes, which they believed caused frequent robberies committed to maintain such expensive garb. Similar rulings, which sought in sometimes contradictory fashion to regulate the clothing worn by, and I quote, Blacks, mulattoes, Indians, and mestizos in Spain's New World colonies, were issued repeatedly from the 16th century until the end of colonial rule in the early 19th century. You might think that these sumptuary laws are a thing of the past, gone from an era that we have left behind. But the core of these regulations remains firmly in place when we still discuss who can wear luxury and who is always suspected of carrying replicas or not being worthy of luxury, whose aesthetics are considered authentic, and who is always suspect of being an interloper trying to dress above their station. The sumptuary laws might be gone, but the racial underpinnings that put them firmly in place in Europe remain in a state of constant reproduction as a persistent cultural artifact. And this is the last I will say about luxury for the time being.
Can I ask a question in between?
Of course.
Great. I think one question that I would have would be, but maybe that's where you're going, is about the link between these notions of luxury, which you have a quite clear narrative about when it comes to, well, the story you just described about who is, deemed, quote, worthy of wearing the originals and who is always suspected to wear fakes, etc. Do you have a link with the communities that are engaged in this, the thing you talked about earlier in the sense of the unreal, the kind of the people that engage in conspiracy theories? Is there that type of link to be made, or is that something that we should maybe talk about separately?
You can see the next slide, and I can do a quick roundout of the
Would be great, yeah.
The next slide. One reason I became so interested in authenticity was because of all the mechanisms that are deployed to authenticate luxury goods. While the gap between the rich and the poor widens, the makers of luxury become more diffuse, the markers of luxury become more diffuse, less exclusive. So new tools need to be deployed to maintain these strict divisions. However, the question of what constitutes authenticity beyond art, design, or fashion is also deeply political. I started today recounting my experience of encountering the world of conspiracy theories for the first time. Closely related to that world is the notion of what constitutes fake, specifically fake news. I do not like the way the expression fake news has been emptied of meaning to become a container for anything that someone disagrees with. And this transcends political lines, as the expression fake news is used both from left and right and more or less interchangeably. I remember when I first started discussing consensual reality with Daniel sometime last year, specifically in regards to how conspiracy theories have become mainstream as a departure from consensual reality. Daniel poignantly remarked that perhaps the issue is not so much that we have departed from consensus-based reality, but that this consensus-based reality never existed in the first place. When what existed instead was a structure that deployed a dominant narrative around reality, and that structure has now collapsed. I was reminded of the constant denial of experiences by people of color in the Netherlands in regards to racism. The general dominant consensus was, until not long ago, that racism was almost inexistent in the Netherlands. There was indeed a consensus reality that did not match the experience of the oppressed. Still to this day, we have news items that tout the supposed Dutch tolerance as a defining national trait, while the reality of people of color, trans people, queer people, etc., clearly tells a different story. So this notion of consensual reality was not so much consensual as it was hegemonic. Fake news and conspiracy theories become counter-hegemonic in that they offered a disruptive opportunity to mainstream politics and ideas that had remained in the fringes. Does this answer more or less your question of why my obsession with authenticity, Daniel?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and I think that that idea of moving from consensual to hegemonic is key here. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to unshare the screen.
Great. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to, keep approaching it from a slightly different angle, but I hope, I'm sure that we will, there's several points where we meet, let's say. So we talked about the usage of words and the discomfort that seems to exist among some people with, fiction that they can do sort of nothing with in the face of this, overarching, this kind of like indeterminate reality. And I think that relates to how, the presumption of a consensual reality and the collapse of that consensual reality as it was perceived, which is, as Flavia says, to a very large extent, merely a hegemonic reality, is sort of adjacent or parallel to this. I think the point being made earlier was that perhaps the epistemic crises that surround us, often the collapse of reliable news and the collapse of a reliable single narrative about reality is talked about as an epistemic crisis, and a crisis about what we can and cannot, how that impacts how and what we know and what we can be certain about. Though these crises are not in fact new or unprecedented, I also think that what we go through is not necessarily entirely new, raise within many people particular concerns and a priori judgments about fiction and poetry, as if these were not art forms, but forms of lying. That is, I think, a key point I want to bring across. That there's obviously not the case, but however, within the current political and aesthetic, landscape, we can say that many forms of fiction and poetry are a priori judged as a form of, lying at worst, or at best speech or language acts that are not useful at transacting. So let's consider the adjacency between lying and fiction and poetry more seriously. Did indeed post-truth and fake news buzzwords of 2016, and we fully subscribe to the strong to a certain opposition towards words of like fake news and post-truth. Nevertheless, post-truth was the word of the Oxford Dictionary of the Year word of 2016, I believe. Did those words really change our perception of reality? 5 years onward, it is a truism that they did. We find it harder than ever to trust the most trustworthy sources and platforms, and our faith in institutions is an all-time low, or so we hear. But what about the consequences of all fake for fiction? Today's barrage of online fantasy narratives and alternative realities has eroded the stability of truth in public life, but may we conversely propose that fake news has undermined fiction? And if so, what can be said in defense of fiction? We were a little surprised, though not really and not completely, to be honest, because the story is more nuanced, when Flavia too confessed that she had lost interest in fiction. But I think we talk about a specific type of fiction here. In a joking mood, I texted back to Flavia, "But Flavia, don't you care for a 59-year-old postal delivery man who one day notices something out of the ordinary?" Thereby kind of parodying the typical single line movie summary that you find on Netflix film listings and that you find in your in-flight movie programs. If this is the future of fiction, that you get a one-sentence summary for some kind of relatable human story or whatever, indeed, there's no future, right? If you take this notion of the log line, together with the rectangular zombie DVD cover art that has weirdly survived the actual DVD object, these deadpan sentences seem to spell out the ultimate bad news for, the future of fiction. What point is it to create world after world after world, genre piece after genre piece after genre piece, costume drama after costume drama, facing not just this amount of reduction, but the very expectation that summary and compression of your story are even possible in this way, right? And when we tell our moving image students that every version or iteration of their film, word, first idea, paragraph, and synopsis are themselves films, how do they prepare for the industry's expectation of narrative as well as the subsequent destruction of that narrative by the log line? Right? And here we hit upon another limitation, or rather assumption, about narrative and fiction, that for it to be relatable, it must be realistic, right? So I think there's a bunch of things that fiction did to itself, perhaps, that we can say is, plays a part, and in a sense maybe creates a gap or a space in which, the type of conspiracy narrative that Flavia has been talking about gets a space to play, because suddenly there's fiction with consequences, and suddenly there's fiction on the terms of the writers rather than fiction on the terms of those who gatekeep what the fiction can be, for an audience. And I think that here we can link it in a cinematic sense in two ways, right? So there are at least 2 points to be made here. One is to do with the presentation of a fictional or partially fictional text as a form of evidence, and the other is to do with literacy. We already said, and with literacy, I don't mean to say like the amount of books you read or that you read your like famous authors or whatnot. I mean just the way that you are able to deal with something with information you get as you work through a text. So we already said that the simulacrum involves a form of literacy, right? Because in order to create a simulacrum, you need to know about the way that the code of the simulacrum works. And the film theorist Ohad Landesman, in an essay titled Lying to be Real, maintains that our relationship to various cinematic objects is never completely determined a priori, but is always dependent on our experience of watching them. So there's always something about a narrative or a fiction that cannot be established by a prior agreement, by a prior, let's say, convention that is established with the viewer. You know, something that idea of the log line, you know, destroys, because it seems to sort of like not recognize that potential. And Landesman's essays focus on the genre of the docufiction, a documentary film that deploys fictional or fictionalized narrative lines, frames, or techniques. And Landesman concludes that docufictions both manifest their markers of fabrication and gloss over their signs of artificiality. They openly acknowledge their manipulative and deceptive facets, but at the same time emphasize their ability to hold informative and evidential value. And I wonder if those types of traits, you know, that we can see in docufictions are there in these types of like crowdsourced or fan fictionalized conspiracy theories that give people, as we go with Flavia's ideas, listeners, or sense of listeners or community. And a sideways point to this, which, you know, I want to conclude with, is to literacy, is made by the poet Cornei Chukovsky in his seminal book on children's poetry titled From 2 to 5, by which he meant the type of poetry that children both create and also enjoy at the age, approximately from the age 2 to 5. The beginnings of poetry for Chukovsky are not in an a priori position of the literary author, you know, but in children's spontaneous creations of poetry, right? So they're in nonsense verses that are, as he says, not so much songs as they are melodic exclamations. They are not recited, but spoken with an accompaniment of clapping and dancing. So this idea of clapping and singing and dancing is sort of more important than the idea that there's like an auteur and a text and a poem. It's really just a way of working with the materiality of language. And this appears to offer support for the idea that poetry and fiction don't go in a separate drawer from nonfiction. They come from a joint starting point, in a sense. And Chukovsky then provides an account of how fantastic tales, such as, you know, those nonsense verses, or also Munchausen, in which a, quote, a hammer flies to the moon, were confronted by authorities that demanded that, quote, books for Soviet children must not be fantasies, not fairy tales, but only the kind that offer most authentic and realistic facts. But please consider, Chukovsky replies to an official at the time, and I think this is in the 1920s, that it is indeed through its fantasy that this fairy tale emphasizes to the children reality. Their very laughter at every adventure of Munchausen testifies to their awareness that he is fabricating and telling ridiculous falsehoods. That is why they laugh, right? So this is an argument that can be made for fiction that considers our literacy about reality and fiction and fake, you know? And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. Not so much literacy as in how the books you read and not, etc., but literacy as a way to signal when something is true, when it isn't. And this, you know, I think it's a particular literacy that we talk about. And I'm not sure whether, I'm not going to say anything about whether we lost it literacy or whether we still have it, but I just think it's important to note here. So just that's it for now, and we'll get back to some other points later.
It's interesting that you bring up the loss, and you imagine quotation marks around the loss, because I know you don't mean it as a loss to mourn, but as something that is out of sight, perhaps. It's interesting to me that vis-a-vis this loss of literature, we have the emergence of political fiction, no? Which is what I'm about to get into. And what I believe makes these things attractive is the co-creation aspect of them. No, We could also talk about the loss, again, loss not in the sense of a loss to mourn, but in the sense of retracting to an out of sight position, the loss of the author. And I think that in film, this is also even more evident, no, Daniel? The loss of authorship as such, in the sense of the author filmmaker of maybe the 70s, or the figure that has been replaced by studios rather than, and of course, Nolan being the exception to this loss of authorship. I cannot believe, and I feel compelled to do that we haven't brought up Tenet once today.
True, we haven't, but we might get there in the next episode, right?
In the next, no, but
Yeah.
it's a constant process. We have to, I mean, it's like a superstition. We have to name it at least once per episode.
I think we've made this film a huge issue and nobody else cares.
It's a meta joke.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And I wanted to get to this notion of the unreal and fiction. I really recommend this issue of the Journal of Design and Science from MIT, because this journal really got into trying to understand the phenomenon of QAnon as a manifestation of the contemporary politics. And in particular, I'm interested in what Ethan Zuckerman, who has become a sort of authority on this manifestation of the emergence of the unreal, even though with Daniel we have had many disagreements with some of his theories. But I think that these theories are super relevant to this discussion of what constitutes authenticity and reality and consensus-based reality. And Zuckerman, what he says is that it's easy to dismiss QAnon as and I disagree with the ableist language here, the craziest manifestation of a crazy time in history. This labeling of things as crazy, but I have an ideological objection to it, because I believe that all these politics around QAnon have nothing to do with crazy or with mental illness, and everything to do with interests that, the interests of capital and power, etc. But anyway, let's go with him in the analysis. For the sake of argument, when global narratives about the spread of liberal democracy are rapidly reversing, authoritarian nationalism is re-emerging, and every established political norm seems negotiable. By embracing the most bloody and absurd theories with a credulity that's more easily parodied than examined, QAnon makes it hard for us to take them seriously. But it's a mistake to look at them as a sort of parody. In 2018, Time magazine declared Q, the person behind this QAnon, one of the 25 most influential people on the internet, alongside Trump, Kanye West, and a couple of journalists. It's a reasonable argument to make. Q's drops thousands of cryptic posts posted on message boards, 4chan, and on the internet at large, have led to countless YouTube videos, podcasts, and an explosion of online and offline writing trying to interpret the utterances of the anonymous Q clearance patriot. In March of 2019, QAnon, An Invitation to a Great Awakening, a book written by a QAnon follower or followers, it's unclear if this is collective authorship or one person behind it. This book peaked at number 2 on Amazon's list of best-selling books. QAnon is interesting not because its predictions of political revolution are correct. Each of them, all of them have been wrong. And it's also not necessarily interesting because they are linked to violent episodes like the takeover of the Capitol. QAnon for me is interesting because of how it deploys politics that I think could be a way of politics moving forward. A movement like QAnon is an inevitable outgrowth of the unreal, an approach to politics that forsakes interpretation of a common set of facts, this consensus-based reality that I mentioned before, in favor of creating closed universes of mutually reinforcing facts and interpretations. QAnon is the first contemporary phenomenon of conspiracy co-creation. Author Walter Kim identifies Q as a storyteller who has mastered the fundamental truth of narrative on the internet. The audience for internet narratives doesn't want to read, it wants to write. It doesn't want answers provided, it wants to search for them. Members of QAnon aren't just readers, they are bakers assembling crumbs of coherent narratives and predictions. And while assembling these narratives, they are remaking the narratives to yield anything that they want the narrative to be. Let me go back to the beginning of today's lecture/discussion. In introducing Beckett and Beckett's construction of reality, I quoted Barbara Smith, who discussed need in terms of listening. And she says, on the strictly physical afflictions to which we may fall victim through such misfortunes as exile, imprisonment, illness, or old age, perhaps the one most acutely felt is loneliness, which means, among other things, the sheer unavailability of listeners. Smith goes on to argue that when there is no one to talk to, and again, I said it before, but it bears repeating, we rarely complain about having no one to listen to. We are deprived because we lack listeners. We lack the opportunity to affect others instrumentally. These Smith's words were in regards to the exchanges between Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. And she sees these exchanges in crucial ways because without each other, Vladimir and Estragon not only have no one to recognize or who recognizes them, they have no one to affect, no one to experience their own perceptions and emotions through. That is, as Smith suggests, tantamount to having no experience at all, no reality. Thus, reality collapses because nobody is listening. And I have to add, is QAnon's collapsed reality, this departure from consensus-based reality, a consequence of this loneliness? Perhaps, and this is mere speculation from my side, as I am not a sociologist, could QAnon be a politics of solitude and lack of community? Journalists call QAnon a mass delusion, and this has become a way to describe it that I am uncomfortable with, even though I agree that there are elements of delusion, but I cannot quite get around to this idea of calling this departure from consensus-based reality a delusion. It is ableist, but also, as I was saying, if QAnon is a mass delusion, then what is white supremacy? A system that created specific laws to dictate how indigenous or Black people could dress in order to maintain a specific division, a strict specific division, is based on what kind of consensus-based reality? And I go back to what Daniel very accurately said when I started bringing up this issue, that Perhaps the issue is that there was never a consensus-based reality. There was just a hegemonic reality that we were all shoehorned into. Once again, my research provides no answers, and I am left with more questions than when I started. I will cut for now for a second so that we can have.
Yeah, maybe we can maybe discuss a little bit about it.
Yes.
You cited the study by Ethan Zuckerman on QAnon, which is indeed a really profound look at the phenomenon. I do want to I wrote down a couple of notes which are to do with first of all the fact that you hold back on the judgment, on echoing the judgments that are made that are in terminologies like crazy, etc. I think is a very important hesitation that you show to actually depart on those tropes, because those are the classical let's say media tropes by which classifications are being made that ultimately do not allow us to really maybe look closer or understand what's going on. I this phrase politics of solitude absolutely echoes with me. I think there's something there that is just seems to be so accurate or so true about this QAnon. But I do have a few things with regard to the take that that was presented. First of all, the role of fan fiction, the role of writing that is being portrayed here. I do think that there's with the idea that writing fiction is not the same as writing with an effect in the world, right? So you do write fiction, but if you write fiction with a handle on world affairs, you're sort of no longer operating on that fictional level. And I think one question that we can ask is whether the QAnon writers are, to what extent the awareness of this plays into what they do. Because there's plenty of examples of collaborative practices that are similar to QAnon in terms of like their collaborative structure, like for example, fan fiction communities, but I'm also thinking about communities around games, for example, and the very logic of gaming, but that do not have a handle on sort of like the way the world works politically to the extent that QAnon has. So in order for QAnon to work the way it does, it needs to intersect at some point with hard power, right? Otherwise, we would simply say, so what, right? We would say, like, this is a group of people that believe certain things, so what? But it's not just that, it's more than that. So there's an intersection with hard power, and it would be too limited to say it's the intersection with the Trump administration. It's a more structural intersection with hard power, where I think that the notion of white supremacy that you mentioned is important to maybe zoom into a little more. And then the notion of language. So the fact that we have QAnon, people that believe in QAnon or that enact QAnon in multiple language spaces, but that the fact that somebody is writing QAnon in Dutch or Polish or German or French does not affect the thread of QAnon in English. So I'm interested to what extent we can harmonize this notion of a multilingual conspiracy space with the notion of the narrative thread. And I'm not aware of how closely that study that you cited sort of looked into that. And the third thing, like next to the sort of language and the intersection with hard power, is the currency of time, right? Because in order to enact QAnon, you need time as a currency, and this gives us a certain amount of predictions about it gives us almost an economic outlook if we consider time a currency. on QAnon. And I think further the allegation of the group that is, spreading falsehood, basically, has in recent years, let's say the last 5 years or something, constantly shifted slightly, right? Like in 2016, the main concern were troll farms, for example. And now we seem to have concluded that the industrial application of the troll is no longer the prime concern, because we have developed literacy around trolls to some extent. And on the other hand, the stakes that can be gained by deploying trolls are more to do with intimidation than to do with influencing viewpoints, let's say. But now it's QAnon, for example. And I think finally, there's, of course, earlier occurrences of internet-based phenomena like Anonymous, for example, that also used collective monikers and used a similar idea of mystique about who's behind it and who's the central figure. And we even had that figure with that question mark, etc. So I think there's some talking points here.
Everything you said, I share because we have discussed this before. But I wanted to go back to what you said, that you agreed with me on not labeling these things as crazy and ableist language. I mean, for the benefit of anyone listening here, I want to say something that I think is very important. We need to decouple political ideas from mental health, because believing in something is not a mark of mental health issues. It's independent. And this thing of calling people that believe in certain things crazy only stigmatizes people who struggle with issues around mental health. I hope that I'm repeating something that everyone listening already knows, but just in case, I feel it's worth repeating. And that's why I want to separate myself from such characterizations, which I think are harmful. The person that grabs a gun and commits a crime based on ideology is not committing the crime because they are quote unquote crazy. They are committing the crime because the ideology they believe in manifested in that way. Millions of people with mental health struggles do not commit crimes, do not do anything remotely monstrous. So that's why I object to these characterizations. I deeply and vehemently oppose them. Like I oppose also calling this a mass delusion, which is not necessarily per se ableist, but it also implies that it can be dismissed because it's not based in this consensus-based reality that we have been discussing. Because if it's a delusion, it's not real. For the people that this is happening, that believe in these things, it's as real as for us other things are real. So we go back to the philosophical questions that we will not answer through these discussions, but are worth bringing up. What constitutes the real then? Is a belief system real just because we materialize it as such? I don't know, I'm asking this mostly in rhetorical form, because this has been at the core what I started because of algorithms and has evolved into the politics of fashion and the politics of conspiracy theories. It's all rooted in the same unsettling question: what constitutes reality, or what constitutes the real, for me at least. And when you said about fan fiction and power, I think that there is something to be said, and this is, I'm getting into Jorge Luis Borges territory here, about writing reality. No, when they write about this collective act of almost communal co-creation, what I believe there is an element is also of writing the reality that you want to see manifesting. It's almost mystical, no? In I would say, the way that it happens, this community co-creation almost has a spiritual element to it without the people involved naming it as such. no, of creating the reality, be the change that you want to see in the world, but then put into a sort of literary artifact. And I don't know if you want me to go next, because then I'm getting into fan fiction, but from the other side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, shall I come, because I had something, I mean, it's not exactly about this, but it's just to
please.
get the narrative going, and then we can get back to the fan fiction after that. But just to, so I think one thing that we talk about is, you know, a certain sense of resolution and literacy of a plot, right? So we do. I think it's still important that the plot of QAnon is multilingual, but the languages in which the plot develops does not affect, you know, what happens in the other language, for example. So anyway, and I do think that in the English, the consideration of English as the main kind of language in which we both look at these phenomena and read about them is still slightly problematic. But okay, let's continue. So I talked about the notion of language that contains obvious falsehoods and the way the literacy that is built up, you know, with children, for example, in like working with that type of language. And an additional example is provided by the work of Karen Gallas. And I stay here in the child like working with children area. Karen Gallas is a currently retired US primary school teacher who has prolifically written about her teaching practice and has developed extensive field notes on work with 1st to 3rd grade children, their modes of discourse and learning. We consider the work of Karen Gallas a kind of refuge or haven for those who are interested in listening to or learning from children, right? We can have a lot of, you know, opinions and ideas about children, but this is actual research. And the following series of observations pertains to a Black student of Karen Gallas whose practice of telling fake or fictionalized stories differed from the normative frameworks that were, without being articulated as such, operative in the class that she was, you know, that she had. And this is from 1995, so it's slightly old. But at the time, the Harvard Educational Review wrote about Gallas's book, The Languages of Learning. In the first part of her book, Karen Gallas explores the talk of children whose cultural and linguistic backgrounds are different from those which are predominant in the school. Among these children is Gianna, an African-American girl who enters 1st grade unfamiliar with the school practice known as show and tell. Gallas reports that one day Gianna tells a fake story using a genre more familiar to her, and as both her sentences and story lengthen, the complexity and manner of her presentation greatly improve. Gallas attributes this change in part to her own decision to minimize her verbal and physical interventions and instead to sit at the back of the classroom and really let her students take the lead during this activity. And while Gianna is at ease with her new genre, some Caucasian, highly verbal boys are severely bored during her telling, and Gallas, quote, labors to understand their actions. As a consequence, Gallas encourages all the children in her class to learn to tell fake stories. With the inclusion of this new genre, she provides an opportunity for those students whose experience has been constrained by traditional school discourse to experiment with forms new to them. So it could serve as a reminder that setting the boundary between what counts as real and what as fake, the boundary between what is deemed to make sense and what is nonsense, is an act of classification that's invested with a power differential similar to a real and fake Hermes handbag. In no small part is the subversive potential of nonsense rhymes based on challenging a dominant prerogative to classify, and as the above citation from Karen Gallas could serve to demonstrate, fiction and poetry tend to emerge from margins where words are things rather than transactional codes. So eventually fiction appears to be vitally important to the construction not just of the world, but of worlds, and in that sense to their politics, if politics is not merely policy, but the construction of alternatives. The Marxist literary theorist Frederick Jameson writes in response to Ursula K. Le Guin's sci-fi novel, The Dispossessed, which contains several fictionalized versions of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, I resist distinguishing between fictive or imaginary frames and real historical ones insofar as all are narratives. And I think that ties in with what you said, Flavia, about rejecting the claim that this is a mass delusion or stuff like that, because it sort of prevents us from dealing with, from considering the material investment with what these words are and how they impact the world. So bearing in mind Michael Reynolds' remark that fiction and non-fiction are two domains that inhabit one another, a spatial translation of this mode of organization or arrangement was proposed on slightly different terms by Frederick Jameson under the name of wrapping. As an example of this postmodern technique, Jameson mentioned the final scene of Andrei Tarkovsky's 1983 film Nostalgia that is featured as the image for the Kaleidoscope lecture series, in which a man sits in a barren landscape next to a dog and a puddle. The country house in the background, the home that he longs for more than anything, has been wrapped inside a Gothic cathedral ruin. This final scene isn't sparing on the grandeur. In the image for the Kaleidoscope series, the country house has been replaced by a Guangzhou Bottega replica of a Bottega Veneta padded cassette handbag, as you know, right? But let's listen to Jameson on the act of wrapping, you know, which considers a different mode of organization of texts than their real, not real, fake, original, etc. binaries. Wrapping, says Jameson, can be seen as a reaction to the disintegration of that more traditional concept Hegel called ground, which passed into humanistic thought in the form named context, felt by its opponents to be basically external or extrinsic, since it seemed to apply the double standard of two radically distinct set of thoughts and procedures, one for the text, the other generally imported from the outside, from history or sociology manuals for the context in question. The problem then seemed to reorganize itself into a formal one. What kind of relationships are we now to establish between these two distinct sets of data or raw materials if the figure-ground relationship is excluded from the outset? What is wrapped can also be used as the wrapper. The wrapper can also be wrapped in its turn. So wrapping differs from unidirectional chronologies in which one thing simply succeeds the previous and the past is so-called erased. Wrapping sits well with uneven and nonlinear development and provides lumpy accolades to hold what cannot be held logically. It relies on a reader, viewer, participant to understand the structures at hand in the encounter rather than beforehand, and it is thus reliant in one form or another on a form of literacy that emerges in the encounter, a similar form of engagement perhaps that is at work in the docufiction discussed earlier. Even if Jameson provides structural guidance into the work of Le Guin, these instructions do not eliminate the suspense at work in the encounter with the work itself, precisely because literacy about the encounter is acquired in the moment. At a structural level, though, wrapping does not as much allow for as ordain anachronistic relationships. As Jameson notes, a Tolkien-inspired countryside of magicians and dragons oddly coexists with spaceships and sci-fi explorers from other planets. In Le Guin, then, we confront something like an alternation between the reality principle of science fiction and the pleasure principle of fantasy. Is it not in this description that we encounter a weirdly similarity to today's moment, both politically as well as weirdly aesthetically? What do you think, Flavia?
I was entranced. I want more. I mean,
this is the moment I'm handing over to you.
No, because I go back to fiction again.
But that's great, no?
No, it is great. But you know what I find hilarious? That you have brought all these very interesting references, like the work of Le Guin, or even you know, this aesthetic analysis. And now I'm about to get into erotic fan fiction involving Hillary Clinton. So we go from these extremes.
Let's do it. I think let's do it.
But I like that tension, no? I like
me too,
that.
Me very much so, yeah.
I like that tension. Let me share my screen. I have to go back to the emergence of the unreal and QAnon, also because going back to the discussions around stigma, Daniel, I'm interested in this idea that QAnon is the extreme manifestation of one side of the equation, but it is by no means unique, and it is by no means something that happens from the quote-unquote right, that the other side also engages in these same fictionalized narratives, because this emergence of the real is not just limited to those that self-identify as right or as left. It's something that has happened across the spectrum. Maybe it has been in the making for a long time, and only now we are noticing. Or maybe I also have to leave the possibility open that it's just us noticing now and others noticing before. You know, I always am very wary of this notion that discovering something and then someone comes and says, everyone knew, it was just you who didn't know. So I go back to this emergence of the unreal. Much as there is a robust online community extending the narrative of virtually any TV show, movie, or beloved work of fiction, QAnons are taking the narrative sketches offered by Q and extending them into a fantasy world, where there is ample fan fiction about things like Harry Potter or Star Trek, or even, to mention Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Many fanfic writers fix the shortcomings of the works that they have read and enjoyed, and they add their own narratives. In the same way, the narratives put forward by Q on the internet is filled with events and predictions and interpretations that were not originally there, in the same way that authors of fan fiction pick on the flaws of the characters or the texts they love, and then they add their own narratives. Q is no different in that. But would it be fair to treat QAnon as an outlier and a harbinger of the unreal when the internet is full of political fan fiction such as this? And I'm quoting from a fan fiction. Thanksgiving is falling apart. None of the dishes are coming together. Your timetable is all out of whack. The food is going to be cold by dinner time. Until Senator Elizabeth Warren, your beloved next-door neighbor, swings by, spreadsheets and spice rack and the hot plates in tow, and calculates the optimal warming temperature for each dish and adds the perfect spices just in time to save Thanksgiving. This is a fan fiction that I haven't written that myself. I picked it from the internet. Another one, it says, you are 12 and you are bad at sports. You have just been informed that you didn't make the cut for the middle school basketball team. So your uncle, President Joe Biden, picks you up from school, which with mom's permission, to surprise you with milkshakes and ice cream after hearing the bad news. That's just the way the cookie crumbles, kiddo, he says, and he pours hot coffee into his no malarkey coffee mug. He then says something of color that you don't catch because you've already started looking at your phone. In No Politician Deserves Fan Fiction, Darcy Wilder writes, fan fiction is another manifestation of the internet on which gossip masquerades as content, masquerading as news. We are living in peak times of what these celebrities' internet presence says about blah, blah. what this cultural event means really, and how Nancy Pelosi's State of the Union protest disrupted everything and changed the way women see themselves in the workplace. Despite being entirely politically meaningless, shallow symbolism, and a toothless attempt at dissent after her utter failure to stop Trump from doing whatever he wants. It's just a gossipy, non sequitur that purposefully misunderstands policy positions in the hope of subverting them. Elizabeth Warren cracking a beer in her kitchen doesn't make her just like us. It probably just means that she noticed that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Instagram live streams from her kitchen were successful. Pete Buttigieg's pre-politics career fixing bread prices and doing a tour in Afghanistan as part of the Anecdote Corps for future presidential candidates doesn't make him a lovable, hardworking millennial striver. There were covers for his CIA activities. You might be tempted to believe that this phenomenon that imagines the rich lives of politicians is niche. Don't make the same mistake I made when I first encountered conspiracy theories. But even the New York Times considers it remarkable enough to devote some space to it. The genre has the capacity to bridge our ferocious political divide, said Thomas Mallon, an author of Republican historical novels. People come up to me and say they never expected to have any sympathy for Nixon, and then they read my book. The portrait of Richard Nixon in Mr. Mallon's novel Watergate is softer than his depiction in textbooks. Readers get a glimpse, for example, of intimate exchanges with his wife, who calls him pal. Mr. Mallon has also written novels about Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. Though he will not classify his work as fan fiction, he does believe that treating politicians as characters helps make sense of their interior lives. For some, political fiction tends toward the absurd. Aaron Frischner, a congressional press secretary on Capitol Hill, tweeted a story in which party leaders duel with Steve Bannon, who whips out a mace and a chain, and the former environmental administrator, Scott Prout, falls through a trap door, and the president is revealed to be a zombie robot. One popular story imagines sexual tension between Senator Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton. In another, the protagonist shares an apartment with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and comforts the Congresswoman after a long day on Capitol Hill. Other fan fictions are less sweet. One personifies America as a man punching Barack Obama in the face. And I will stop for a moment because I only have one more segment on beauty and how it ties all of it together. But does this not complement your musings on fiction, Daniel?
I just want to maybe can you bring up the slide again with the potluck cooking.
Dan, let me.
Because I have just a remark about them.
There it is, there it is.
I hope, first of all, that you can read those to us as well.
Should I read?
I think you should, because their content. I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about it, like some of the tropes in these tweets, but yes. Also just maybe you can read, or I can read one.
I will read them. But I have to clarify for anyone who might not be aware who Pete and Justin and everything, what this means. Pete and Justin is Pete Buttigieg, the previous presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, and Justin is his husband. Pete is gay, And in this fan fiction, Melanie Benjamin says, in my fantasies, Pete and Justin will have Kamala Harris and his wife, Doji, over for weekly potlucks that Michelle Obama will crash with a bottle of wine and gossip, after which Dr. Jill and Joe, this is Joe Biden and Jill, his wife, bring the dogs over along with some homemade brownies to enjoy while they all sing karaoke. I mean, I cannot even imagine spending that much time imagining these fictionalized scenarios with people that are as excited as a wet kitchen towel. With the exception of Michelle Obama, with whom I would have no problem sharing a drink.
Well,
the other one,
yeah,
which is a response to this one, says, my fantasy is late nights with chicken masala, while Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, plus ones, that is the respective partners, and Obama and Hillary's plus one, imagine this in Bill Clinton, talk strategy about how to strengthen our system so this never happens again, and smile about how much joy is now possible even with all the hard work. So you have chicken masala with Bill Clinton. That's your fantasy. I mean, and then there is the last one, who daydreams that Elizabeth Warren comes along to fix her taxes. I feel that if I ask Elizabeth Warren to do my taxes, she would be like, here's an expense tracker. Email me your documents. I'm already on the phone with the IRS. That's the tax authority in the US. I'm pulling up your retirement contributions now. Was the visit to Chipotle on July 6th a work meeting? Let's say yes. This was a tweet. Someone spent time drafting these as a literary work. So I feel,
thank you for reading them.
I feel dirty now.
Well,
It's like if I can read erotic fiction in public.
I mean, when read in a voice, these cinematic little scenarios, you know, which are a little bit like sitcoms, right?
Yes.
Become sort of more articulated. But I do have this observation that each of them involves food. And that also counted for the one that you read that you didn't show, that they all had food and big aspirational ideas about prestige and competence as being sort of core tropes. But all three that you read, this is the one thing that I noted while you were giving the previous segment, was that all three of them begin with something that qualifies them as dreams. So there's the first one that says, in my fantasies. The second says, my fantasy is. And the third says, I feel like if, and then we get the Elizabeth Warren tax IRS dream. And this to me seems to be distinct from the notion of a QAnon enacted, hyperstitional trope as it goes, because they don't qualify this stuff as fantasy.
I believe you are right there, and that there is a very clear break between what QAnon poses as facts and truth and what is like a desirable, like these fan fictions express a desire rather than a factual, like something that actually happened. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Still, I believe that this idealization of political figures is an interesting phenomenon. I do not put these on the same level as harassing people because in your mind they're pedophiles, because you have made up this story that these people are, Satan worshippers and pedophiles. It's in a completely different league. But I think that this, I would say, almost humanization of political figures, or, this closeness that people feel, is not so different across the political spectrum.
Yeah. Let me share my screen for the next segment. I'm wondering if everyone's doing fine, actually. This is maybe like after 2 hours of nonstop talking, maybe it's good to just ask that first. How are people doing? Generally good? Great. Okay, well, if you're not, please say so, because of course we're here for you.
It's a miracle that they're still here.
It's unbelievable, and we haven't looked at YouTube, but let's hope. So we convened, in a sense, or converged on this notion of anachronistic dragons and magicians, and then sci-fi explorers as an alternation, as Jameson wrote, between the reality principle of sci-fi and the pleasure principle of fantasy. So is it not in this description that we encounter a weird similarity to today's moment, both politically as well as weirdly aesthetically? The epistemic crises that surround us are not entirely new. The issue is rather that their immersive media environments, propaganda, conspiracy, post-truth, trolls, fake tweets making the rounds in Telegram and WhatsApp channels, etc., and then only talking about the media side or technology side, have enraptured new audiences that have little prior literacy about them, and have at the same time found attachment to state power, whereas it was previously believed that the digital space was somehow insulated from government interference, as autocrats the world over lacked the literacy to get Facebook and Twitter. You know, so this is something that where I think we could go back to the techno-optimism that was involved in these, early expectations about the role of social media, that also, of course, Ethan Zuckerman contributed to with the theory, the cute cat theory of political participation from 2008. So we now know that hard power, unfortunately, does get the internet. And we somehow believed, I think, and this speaks to this sort of new enrapture, the enrapture of new audiences by conspiracy and propaganda. We somehow believe that history, or rather the end of history, had insulated us from the return of ghosts that for many people have never been away in the first place. I think that the notion that this is pertaining to audiences that thought that these things were over is a key element here as well, because for many, this has never been over. The ways in which then the effects of propaganda, the rise of authoritarian politics, that also the text that Flavia quoted referred to, and other developments together have eroded belief in a stable reality, is connected to some kind of structural crisis of liberal democracy. That's it's a system, we can say, that stands sort of defenseless against what political scholars Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes have called imitation and its discontents. So there is a alternative approach or route to describe the current situation, which relies a little bit less on the community aspect and a little bit less on the psychology of loneliness and the idea of a sort of politics of solitude that you talked about, Flavia, and a little bit more on political discourses that have been going on around liberalism. And in Khrushchev and Holmes's view, for example, the year 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union kicked off not the structural reform of the former Eastern Bloc countries according to a liberal democratic source code available and flowing freely from west to east, but instead, as they say, and quote, an imitation democracy, a Potemkin facade with a superficial resemblance to democracy. And they talk about imitation, I think, quite a big deal. And I think it's interesting to bring it up because we, of course, talked about, Hermes bags and Guangzhou Bottega and whatnot. And though the imitation hypothesis has far-reaching consequences for the prevailing latter-day political truisms, such as soft power, which is the form of power that exists out of influencing others by having them adopt your language, being an example, etc., we feel that this idea of, imitation being the kind of culprit is still a little too invested in this idea that there's a quality difference between original and copy to be accounted for. So in the previous concept, soft power, which is very much the concept that I think both, let's say, the Clinton era, but also Obama and also in a sense Biden have operated in soft power. It was a great asset to be imitated. The more, the better. But we can also say that if there was no great original, no Hermes bag to begin with, you know. And I've been looking a lot at sort of like late 1980s and early 1990s sort of Western export to Russia and Eastern Europe to think about ways in which this so-called original already had a lot of elements of the simulacrum to begin with. So this is a separate trope that we could go into but won't sort of today. But I want to zoom in on something to do that Khrushchev and Holmes talk about, that's to do with language, which I think is very interesting. They assess the following. A decade or so ago, non-Americans assumed that the spread of English meant that American values and ideas were conquering the world. In his theory of linguistic justice, the philosopher Philippe van Parijs suggested that a special language tax should be imposed on members of the Anglophone communities to subsidize the cost of English learning by members of non-Anglophone communities. The justification offered for such a transfer program was that English speakers reap massive unearned benefits from having been raised with English as their mother tongue. But the authors argue, in reality, the disadvantage is on the English native speaker side. According to a Gallup poll, quote, only about a quarter of Americans can converse in any language other than English. And among that quarter of Americans, 55% are Spanish speaking, for many of whom Spanish is actually their first language rather than a second. The asymmetry between monolingual Americans and those whose mother tongue is not English, but who nevertheless speak English with relative fluency, is one of the most important power asymmetries in the world. The world knows America much better than America knows the world, end quote. And obviously a similar point on English can be made without relying on this idea of mirroring or this idea of imitation or this idea of soft power, and instead be argued along the lines of standardization. As a legal scholar, David Grewal expressed in an interview in our 2010 book on corporate identity. Oh my God, that's 11 years ago, but here it is. If you can see it through the, you can actually come because of the Zoom background, which is interesting, but here's that book. He identified the structural power at work here as network power, which is disconnected from particular countries. English in this account is a language protocol that would survive the United States, even if the United States would vanish into the sea, because tech platforms would still speak it. So this idea that language is an asset of a particular political constituency, like a country, etc., is like nuanced by this idea that actually language is more of a standardized, part of a standardized protocol that can survive these territorial-based sort of like political forms of power. So what I think we talk about is a more complex organization of fact and fiction than the simple distinction between them or the simple boundary between them. So how can fiction help express these kinds of redistributions in kind of a new typology, you know, that the topology, I should say, that's maybe counterintuitive. And in order to get there, we return to Jameson's account of Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which presupposes twin planets, one of which is civilized, being geologically and meteorologically well favored, while the other, Inaris, far more barren, has been uncolonized until its settlement as the result of a peaceful revolution in which the anarchist opposition under their woman leader Odo is allowed to secede with a fleet of aged spacecraft to build their utopia on the unpromising twin planet. The resultant revolutionary society is an impoverished and regimented one. Everyone must work, their tasks are assigned by computers, bureaucratic conformism has set in, which is oppressive for misfits and oddballs, the characterological heretics and dissidents of this particular social order. Finally, communications with Uras, which is the other planet, I should have added that. Sorry, just something that slid out, but that's the first one. Communications with Euros are reduced to a strict minimum. No capitalist propaganda, few exchanges, and a single spaceship landing once a month in a carefully patrolled and sealed off checkpoint. It is surely very difficult not to read this 1974 novel as a thinly disguised fable about the opposition between the United States, or the capitalist West, and the Soviet Union. And there's the protagonist Shevek, who is an ambivalent kind of defector or dissident, moving between the two. And here's that topology. So actually, this is the only image in the presentation in which we have Euros and Anaris. So we have actually two rival planets in a way that each contains aspects of the other. So there is a weird way in which the binary between the two doesn't really work as a topology, because one is sort of inhabited by the other. I think that's the key point I want to make, is to do with the creation of a topology for fiction and fact that is not accountable for in the kind of binary system that we think about between, you know, fiction and fact, or real and fake, or whatnot. So Anaris is essentially a breakaway planet from Euros, set up according to utopian principles, yet barren and seen by Euros as a depository of resources rather than as a political counterpart in its own right. And Jameson writes, the richest part of Euros, where Shevek first lands, is to be sure a capitalist analog of the United States. But alongside it, on the same planet or moon, there exist other countries and continents, and they turn out to represent Maoist China, the third world, as Jameson called it, and finally even the Soviet Union itself. So now suddenly we have a bewildering multiplicity of reference. It is not that Anaris includes several things at once, different social systems, different regimes, different places. It is rather that other places within this novel also simultaneously mean the same thing on different levels. So what we see here, I think, is that through a spatial arrangement based on wrapping, apparent opposites inhabiting one another, the idea of locating one particular trait, such as original or fake, in one particular actor or agent or territory, is overcome by a kind of multi-leveled appearance of a world in the world. And such an arrangement would allow us to overcome the annoyingly persistent duality of original and copy. So I think that's interesting from the point of view that this is something that fiction can provide to reality, that in a sense reality cannot provide to reality.
I want to go back to your comments on language, Daniel, because you mentioned before in your comment, and I didn't address it then, but now that you have expanded on the hegemonic aspects of English and how almost laughable those, those charges are, you mentioned that the language of these conspiracy theories are written like English is the dominant language, but then you have all these other languages also interacting. And funny enough, I only became interested in QAnon as this, present day hegemonic conspiracy once it became a thing in the Netherlands. Since I'm very focused in my own work in terms of what happens in the Netherlands because of our local politics, my mind was blown when I saw the extent through which this had spread in the country. I don't know how reliable the figures are, but some polls suggest that between 10 and 15% of people living in the Netherlands believe in some of these ideas, not the totality of the QAnon universe, which is huge and it would be topic for another seminar altogether. But between 10 and 15% of people living in the Netherlands believe this. And as you rightfully pointed out, the narratives are being written in Dutch, while similar narratives exist in Polish, in English, etc. And I think in that context, the comments that you have made, all these ideas that you have discussed around language are super important. How do we talk about a collective produced fiction that is actually multilingual? I don't know of any modern day precedent for that.
Do you want to conclude with the last segment?
Yes, it's not very, it's actually just a roundup. I will, I mean, I return to some of my obsessions as usual, mostly because I wanted to tie today's discussions of what is fake and what is real, what is authentic, with some ideas from our previous lecture, especially in regards to how Enlightenment thinkers used to believe that aesthetic experiences were forms of truth. Kant was one of the people who believed that the aesthetic experience was not only a universalized phenomenon, but it was also only comparable to truth if you experience beauty. It was almost tautological. If you experience beauty, it meant that that thing that was producing the pleasurable experience was true, and at the same time, simultaneously, it was also beautiful because it was true. A tautological circle, and I discussed in the last lecture how Kant's categories of beauty, which were foundational to racial categories, were constituted as universal truths. And we have gone through in the last lecture about the aesthetic categories of race, how Kant constituted them, and the imagination of the time assembled a variety of individual images from experience and united them into a single representative average, which they called at the time of Enlightenment the normal idea. That then became the standard for judging the physical dimensions of all individuals. As a result of these, the phenotypical representation of the white man became also the universal representation of beauty. And then I have to ask myself, why could Kant never imagine the face of an interracial or non-white ideal of beauty? Of course, this is at the core of my interest in this. Despite the focus on the subjectivity of aesthetic interpretation through individual judgment, Kant goes on to explain that the judgment of taste is also universal. He considers this in regard to the knowledge of how things are, or their quote-unquote theoretical knowledge, and to how things should be, or their morality. This is how the idea of beauty and morality became inextricably tied. So when our experiences of beauty and authenticity and what constitutes the real rest on these foundations, I have to once again ask what constitutes the real, not just in material terms, but also in regards to these abstract notions of luxury, beauty, and ultimately the consensus-based reality that we have been discussing. I have tried to bring you through my own research into the politics of fake and authenticity, because I believe that these categories, just like the taxonomies I bring up every time, are built on a foundation that has become instrumental to the exclusionary nature of capital. Which bodies belong where? Which borders can we cross? Not merely the physical borders, but also the borders of class, race, sexuality, etc. And while my discussions on the subject might seem scattered, even fragmented, it is because I see these issues as part of an entanglement that forces us to look at them as parts of a whole rather than separate and distinct from one another. So this is all I have for now. And I'm sharing with you on the screen. You can buy on the internet an exact replica of Obama's presidential desk for 26,000 yuan. You have to divide by 8 that. And it's a full wood carved executive desk. And it's identical. I mean, I've looked at the photos and the videos they made of the replica, and it's undistinguishable from the desk that you can find in the White House where Obama signed his executive orders, etc. So I leave you with that for today. And yeah, the perennial question, what constitutes authenticity? Thank you. You are mute, Daniel.
I wanted to conclude, thank you so much. I wanted to conclude also with a poem. Ocean Vuong, tell me something good. You are standing in the minefield again. Someone who is dead now told you it is where you will learn to dance. Snow on your lips like a salted cut, you leap between your deaths, black as God's periods. Your arms cleaving little wounds in the wind. You are something made, then made to survive, which means you are somebody's son. Which means if you open your eyes, you'll be back in that house beneath a blanket printed with yellow sailboats. Your mother's boyfriend, his bald head ringed with red hair like a planet on fire, kneeling by your bed again. Air of whiskey and crushed Oreos. Snow falling through the window, ash returned from a failed fable. His spilled ink hand on your chest, and you keep dancing inside the minefield, motionless. The curtains fluttering, honey light beneath the door, his breath, his wet blue face, earth spinning in no one's orbit, and you want someone to say, hey, hey, I like your dancing, it's gorgeous, a little waltz to die for, darling. You want someone to say all this is long ago. That one night, very soon you'll pack a bag with your favorite paper bag and your mother's 45 caliber. That's the surest shelter, was always the thoughts above your head. That it's fair, it has to be, how your hand hurts us, then give us the world. How you can love the world and then there's nothing left to love but yourself. Then you can stop. Then you can walk away back into the fog, walled minefield, where the vein in your neck adores you to zero. You can walk away. You can be nothing and still breathing. Believe me.
Absolutely beautiful poem. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it was necessary to include something recent as well, because I realized my examples were like super old, most of them. Shall we take a little break and then get back to like a discussion of some sort, if people would like that? Maybe we do need
questions and comments. Comments are very welcome. 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5. So that's 30, right? Like 4:30.
Yes,
CET. We'll be back. Yeah. Right. Are we ready to resume?
Very much. Why did you feel, can I ask you something? Why did you feel your references were old? I mean, I'm bringing Kant up. So.
I don't know, just having like dates like 1983, etc. If you have like just a lot of these dates, you feel like, don't you have anything more recent, to talk about? But of course, when we talk about the past, we always talk about the past in the present. We don't talk about the past as the past. We talk about the ways in which the past continues, no?
Yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'm interested in the most, as you know, Daniel. These things that we discuss as part of historical processes rather than as contemporary, isolated, phenomenons. If anyone has a question or a comment or anything, a remark, please, you are very welcome, because we don't have much time left. So
I have a question.
yes, Jan.
Hi.
Hello.
It's a question that's kind of going into something that's only tangentially related to what you were talking about, I suppose. But Flavia was talking about not wanting to see Q through the angle of mental health, and to decouple mental health from political analysis, so to say. And I was wondering, or I was sort of left with the question, like, where does that leave, for instance, the frame of madness in Fanon's Damned of the Earth, or the frame of schizophrenia in Deleuze and Guattari? Aren't these still useful ways of understanding political tendencies?
I will jump in and answer first, because last year I did a whole seminar on this, and I'm hoping, Jan, that next year we can get into that in our seminars together as well. What I think that Fanon's notions of madness in regards to the political are absolutely on point. What I don't want to fall into the trap of using mental health issues to justify actions that are not related to mental health per se. Like, for instance, perfectly sane people believe that immigrants should be rounded up and deported tomorrow. This is perfectly sane people believe this. When people that believe this in groups like QAnon, they are dismissed as crazy. Whereas there are lots of people that have mental health issues and we could call crazy, that do not hold any of these beliefs, that do not think that people should be dehumanized and treated badly. So I want to decouple this notion that believing in this is a symptom of madness. Perfectly sane people believe monstrous things, and also perfectly crazy people believe things that are completely humane and compassionate. So this is why I don't want that kind of stigma associated with mental health. You see it often when people commit horrible crimes. Oh, it was a crazy person. And maybe the person has some mental health issues. Maybe they didn't. It's this notion that only the crazy can commit these things, when it's proven that that's not the case. Does that clarify a bit what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question. It's Nikki Stay. Sorry, I have my acronym. I think to pick up on that, you spoke about Beckett earlier and Waiting for Godot, and then the idea of decoupling mental illness from politics. But I find in Waiting for Godot, there's a monologue given by Lucky, which for me is the most important conversation that actually happens in that play and writing. So I guess if one had to decouple mental illness from political stance or positioning, what now in this kind of era or space would you kind of state as the character of Lucky in society today? The silent voice that's quite oppressed, and then when kind of ordered to speak has, you know, this kind of like intertextual kind of way of being and creating new words, making no sense, but having a lot of information at the same time. Sorry, that's quite a long question, but yeah.
I think that perhaps I wasn't clear enough. What I meant to say is separate mental health from the stigma that comes from certain politics. Mental health will never be separated from politics, because people who have who struggle or who deal with mental health issues also have politics. What I don't want, and I do my best not to participate, is to assign stigmatizing notions on mental health. That if you have, if let's say, I will speak for myself here, I sometimes struggle with issues surrounding anxiety or depression, or, you know, like so many others. And then to think that because I struggle with that, I'm quote unquote crazy, and then my political ideas are a result of being crazy. Whereas that's not the case. They're like, you can be crazy and have political ideas, but at the same time, those political ideas don't have to have the negative stigma associated with them. And this happens mostly when people commit crimes or when people hold ideas that we find reprehensible. We say that QAnon are crazy because they believe in right-wing things that are very damaging. And I don't believe that they have these politics because they're crazy. I think that those things are separate. And that's the kind of stigmatization that I don't want to participate in. That doesn't mean that mental health and politics don't go together, but they don't go together in stigmatizing ways. Is that clarification clearer now?
Yes, that's definitely clear. But I think my main point was to ask, what would you characterize as a Lucky in society these days in terms of, a voiceless character?
A dissenter. Because the monologue that you refer to, yes, it expresses things that we could characterize as non-normative. Maybe neuroatypical would be a better way to describe it. And I think that neurotypical and neuroatypical are more useful labels than crazy, or, you know, like I said, stigmatizing things.
Do we have more questions? Don't think we do, actually.
Either we bore them to tears or everyone is overwhelmed. That's
Or a combination of those, which is also possible. Yeah, well, anyway, I think if we don't have any more questions, then the ones that we had, I mean, that was great, actually. Thanks, everyone, for staying with us for all this time. You have any, well, the concluding remarks were pretty much there, no, Flavia? Already, yeah. So we see each other back on the May the 19th then, with the next event on Dictator, Chic, and what might succeed it. I'm looking forward to that one, probably maybe a very visual session.
probably.
Yeah. And as always, ethics, aesthetics, and politics are joined together in these talks. And thank you again, Flav, for the honor.
I have to say, I'm very, very happy that we brought these topics to the school. I've been reading one last remark, that one of the reasons that art schools, art academies no longer talk about aesthetics is a puritanical, is part of the tradition of puritanical belief that if we talk about beauty, we also have to talk about pleasure, and that would not be good at all. So I'm very happy that we are breaking through some of these ideas and the historical processes that inform them now.
Very much so. Yeah, and I do think we need to maybe get at that sort of Kantian problem with the good and the beautiful and stuff like that, because that is something we need to really, really sort of home into, right? To probably, I mean, what do you want to do with that?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I want to smash it, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to go for like we should like really destroy it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that next time. Maybe final episode, or maybe we can do it in 2 episodes because it will be a big task, or not. Maybe this whole thing will just give in like a Potemkin facade.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. The house of cards of
right.
beauty.
Okay.
Anyway,
Well, yeah.
thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Flavia. Thanks, Eva, for everything. And we see you hopefully on the 19th of May.